Chapter 6, it tells us a story of the prophet Elisha. Elisha has spent years as a prophet already, studying under his predecessor and mentor Elijah to become a voice for God. As he's seen his mentor transition into life with God, he's now taken over the reins as one of the key prophets. And he does so primarily in the kingdom of Israel. He spent time at this point already healing some people, being miraculously fed by the widow's oil, speaking on behalf of God. He's had some people come against him for the kinds of things he said. And then he enters this new season. He's no longer just learning to be a prophet. He's no longer just doing miracles individually and with small sets of families. He enters a season where he's going to spend most of his time working with the king of Israel on fending away the armies from the Arameans. The Arameans have decided they want to conquer Israel, that they want the land that Israel owns, and so they've set their armies against them. The king of Aram has started to attack, and in doing so, he's been setting up camps, hoping to set traps for Israel's army and king. Yet somehow during that time, Elisha keeps getting a word from God. He keeps knowing in advance where the Arameans are setting up their camps, and so he keeps turning to the king of Israel and saying, hey, be careful right there because that's where your enemies are. Ignore that spot or walk a different path. Don't let that be a trap for you. And so camp after camp gets set up, and Israel continuously avoids every trap that's laid before it. It gets to the point where the king of Aram is highly concerned by this. In 2 Kings 6:11, he starts to question it. It says that he's enraged, and so he summons his officers, and he demanded of them, tell me, which of us is on the side of the king of Israel? Who here is the traitor? Who's been leaking the information to our enemies about what we're trying to do? Immediately, somehow, the officers in the room say, well, we're sorry, King, but you're wrong. There's nobody that's a traitor. There's nobody that's been leaking the information. They've got a man of God on their side. The prophet Elisha has been telling their king about all our plans. He can hear even the things you say in your bedroom. The king hears that and decides his new plan isn't just to try to kill the king of Israel. He wants Elisha himself, the prophet, the man of God, killed. And so he says, tell me where he lives. Tell me where he is residing. We need to go attack him. And they say, well, we've heard that he lives in Dothan, and so let's go there. And so the armies are sent, horses and chariots and the armies making their way towards Elisha's home in Dothan. I'm curious, if I was the king, how you hear the phrase from your officers, this man hears about all of your plans in advance when you talk about them, and then you talk about the plan publicly. Elisha, as has been his pattern, knows what's coming. He's sitting with one of his servants, and the servant starts to hear some things around them. He hears the chariots and the horses, the shouting of the army, and he gets concerned. Elisha, what are we going to do? The army's at our doorstep. Elisha looks at his servant and simply says, we don't need to be concerned. You see, our army is bigger than theirs. The servant's kind of puzzled and confused. What do you mean our army is bigger than theirs? We don't have a very big army. Did you call in some reinforcements from the Hittites or the Egyptians or something? Did you make some kind of alliance I don't know about? And Elisha offers a prayer. God, would you open the eyes of my servants so that he could see? And as Elisha finished praying, his servant's eyes are opened, and he looks to see that they're surrounded by chariots of fire and spiritual armies, horses and soldiers that they see encircling them. Suddenly he has confidence that there's this great army on their side. Elisha prays one more thing. He prays at that moment, God, would you also blind the Arameans? And so the army from Aram walks into Dothan, where Elisha is. Elisha walks out to meet them after praying that they will have been blinded, stands before them as the man they're looking for, and says to them, hey, the man you're looking for isn't here, but I can take you to where he is. This isn't the city you meant to come to. This isn't the man that you meant to find. I'll take you to where you need to go. Because their eyes have been blinded by God, they decide to follow Elisha. He walks them from Dothan to Samaria, the capital city of the king of Israel at the time, where the army and forces would be. And as the army of the Arameans is walked into the courtyard in Samaria, the king of Israel looks at Elisha and says, "What do you want me to do?" Elisha prays, "God, open their eyes now." And the Arameans' eyes are opened and they recognize, oh no, we're not at the city or town of a prophet. We're in front of the king, our enemy who we've been trying to kill. I wonder what he's going to do. The king, who has seen Elisha lead them well so far, turns to his prophet and says, "What should I do? Should I kill them? Should I slay my enemies before me and end this war with the Arameans by their army being led into our midst and slaughtered?" Elisha says, "No. That's not the way you would have treated prisoners of war if you had won them by the sword. Just because God has delivered them into your hands doesn't mean you should kill them. Set out some food for them. Set out some water for them. Allow them to eat and drink, and then send them home." So the king, trusting Elisha, sets out food, sets out drink, allows them to eat and get refreshed, and then sends them back to their master. At the conclusion there in 2 Kings 6, it says, "So after he prepared a great feast for them," in verse 23, "and after they had finished eating and drinking, he sent them away, and they returned to their master. And so the bands from Aram stopped raiding Israel's territory." It's a season. A season of learning from his mentor. Then there's a season of doing miracles with the widow's oil. And then he raises somebody from the dead. And now he's helped end the war, at least for a time. We'll jump in here in a moment to the next part of the story that starts with sometime later, the king of Aram sent armies again. And we don't know how long that is, but this season closes and Israel's at peace. Because of the way Elisha had led them in front of the king, because of their generosity towards their enemies leave and say, we don't need to fight them anymore. They clearly hear from God. They clearly have something going on that we don't understand, and they were nice to us. And so for a time, there's peace. That season will end, and a new season will begin. It's no different sometimes than our own lives as we recognize their seasons. Our own church has had seasons. 105 years or so worth of seasons. Seasons where it felt like we were just getting off the ground and learning. Seasons where it felt like maybe we were dealing with the issues and relationships of just the couple of families involved. And then maybe even seasons where it felt like there was battle going on and something needed to be raised from the dead. There's been seasons. As we get ready next week to launch into having 3 services, we'll start what I believe is a new season. And yet at the same time, I know there's people in the room here who are saying, "What do you mean a new season? We've done that before. We had 3 services like 10 years ago. What? That's not a new season. We're just kind of repeating things." Because there are people who have attended this church faithfully and worshiped God here faithfully through lots of seasons. In fact, just by show of hands, I want to figure out some of what's represented in the room. So we're going to start by everybody raising their hand. So just everybody raise one hand. Those are all the people that are here and have attended at least one time. And so I'd be curious, you can put your hands down if you've attended less than 5 years. If you've attended this church less than 10 years. Less than 15 years? Less than 20 years? Put your hands down. 30 years? How long have you attended? 43 years. Let's give them a round of applause. 43 years, not simply a faithful attendance to this church, as fun as that is to celebrate. 43 years of worship and celebration of who God is. In the first service this morning, 3 different families, over 80 years, at this church. They've seen seasons some of us know nothing about. Seasons that come and go, like seasons in Elisha's life that turn from studying to doing a couple of miracles to defending the entire nation through things, and then new seasons as they begin. The story continues. Sometime later, we don't know how long, but still during Elisha's lifetime, Ben-Hadad, the king of Aram, mobilized his entire army and marched up and laid siege to Samaria. We've talked about this before, what this lay siege means. When they lay siege, it's a war tactic that essentially says you use your army to force them into their own town. You cut off the supply chains of water and food and assume that you can starve them out of what they've done by not allowing access. They're literally left inside, fortified inside their own walls because of their enemy. And the Arameans have come and they've done that to Samaria, the capital city of the king at the time. It says that they've done that in a way, verse 25, that there was a great famine in the city. The siege lasted so long that a donkey's head sold for 80 shekels of silver and a quarter of cab of seed pods for 5 shekels. I'm sure those are all prices we're really familiar with. When we think about it, maybe it's not donkeys' heads and cabs of seed pods, but we understand that when crisis happens, when culture shifts in a way, that one of the ways you can tell how bad things are is by looking at the price of some things. That we may say, things got so bad, the price of a gallon of gas went up to, or a gallon of milk went up to, or a gallon of water went up to. Just months ago, as hurricanes went through Texas, we saw news stories come up. Pictures going to show up from Best Buy, a Best Buy store with some cases of water they had for sale. I understand that you might not be able to read clearly the price tags on there, and so it'll zoom in a little bit. Roughly $43 for a case of water. 24-pack of water bottles being sold in a store in Houston after the hurricanes for $43. We recognize that sometimes the prices of staple goods can dictate to us how bad the circumstances might be. And that's what's happening here in Samaria. The prices of things like the donkey's head or the seed pods, the things they would need to do their agriculture and their livestock, those things have skyrocketed because things have become awful inside the Samaria during the famine. It goes on to then tell more of a story. It says there's a woman who's out on the wall in the city, and the king of Samaria, the king of Israel, is walking through, and this woman cries down to the king, "My king, please help me." The king looks up and says, "What is it that you want me to do? If God hasn't delivered us, there's no new wine coming from the winepress. There's no new grain coming from the threshing floors. I don't have some resource that has come from somewhere. What is it that you're hoping I'll do? If God hasn't showed up, how do you expect me to help?" And she continues to cry out her story. But you don't understand. Just yesterday, I made a deal with another family. Another mom and I decided that we were so hungry that we needed to eat one of our kids. And so we made a deal. Yesterday we would eat my kid. And then today we would eat hers. And so yesterday I sacrificed my son and we ate him. And then today when we went to get hers, she had hidden him. She didn't hold up her end of the bargain. Can't you help? And the king hears those words, and it's no longer the price of donkeys or seeds or water or gas or milk. He's struck with the tragedy and grief of his people. He falls to his knees, rips off his clothes. Underneath, it's revealed then to those that are witnessing that he's been wearing the clothes of mourning already. And as he's grieving, he cries out about what will happen. May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if the head of Elisha, son of Shaphat, remains on his shoulders today. The new plan: kill the prophet. The text doesn't clearly state it, though the context from the verses that will follow will imply that the reason the king wants Elisha dead is because he has been listening to Elisha throughout this famine. Elisha, who had delivered them into safety before, who had helped them stop the war before, who had found peace because of his leadership before, that this king will have approached Elisha about this siege, and Elisha will have said, "We're not going to run. We're not going to fight. And we're not going to surrender. We're going to wait for God to provide for us." And as the king is overcome with the grief of the situation of the people in the city, he says, as a leader, how can we not have either run or fought or surrendered? There has to be a different way. I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, we're going to stop just waiting for God to show up. It's too bad. The situation is too dire. We won't just trust in God anymore. If I know anything, it's that we're going to cut ties with that plan. Let's go kill Elisha. And so he sends a messenger, and he runs after the messenger. Elisha is at home. And we may understand the pattern that sometimes Elisha gets advance notice from God of things that are coming. And so he's sitting at home with his elders surrounding him and suddenly says to them, "Hey, there's a messenger coming. He wants to murder me." If you can listen closely, you won't just hear the footsteps of a messenger. You'll actually hear the king behind him. And at that moment, there's a knock on the door. And the messenger asks Elisha to come out. And not long after that, the king shows up. And the king begins to speak to Elisha. The king says to him, "This disaster is from the Lord. Why should I wait for the Lord any longer?" And Elisha replies, "Hear the word of the Lord. This is what the Lord says. About this time tomorrow, a seah of the finest flour will sell for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley for a shekel at the gate of Samaria." Or something more along the lines of, Best Buy won't be selling water for $43. It will be like the Black Friday sale, where every kind of luxury and blessing you could ever want will be as cheap as it ever gets. The water will flow freely. The food will be easy to come by. We'll be celebrating and feasting together, even if you have no resource. Elisha says, just trust in God. Tomorrow, things will be different. The officer on whose arm the king was leaning said to the man of God, "Look, even if the Lord should open the floodgates of heavens, could this happen? Even if God was in control the way you say is, even if he opened up all of the resources he had and gave us all of the blessings at his disposal, could it really be as good of a picture as you've just painted?" And Elisha says, "You'll see it with your own eyes, but you will not eat any of it." You'll get to see everybody else celebrating and feasting, but because of your doubt and disbelief in who God is, you won't get to participate in any of it. And then the scene shifts. The story moves from being focused on Elisha and the king and the grief of the city to 4 different men, 4 lepers. Now there were 4 men with leprosy at the entrance of the city gate, and they said to each other, "Why stay here until we die? If we say we'll go into the city, the famine is there and we will die. And if we stay here, we will die. So let's go over to the camp of Arameans and surrender. And if they spare us, we live. If they kill us, then we die." They just run, these 4 outcasts with their skin disease, kicked out of this city by the Samaritans. They're outside the city gates, and they think, well, we'll die if we stay here. If we go into the city, they first of all would kick us out, and they don't have food anyway, so we die if we go there. Worst case scenario, if we walk into our enemies, they kill us. That's no different than what we have here. But best case scenario, what if they accept our surrender? What if they allow us to join their camp? What if we get to eat today? Let's go there and see if they'll accept us. And so at dusk, they get up and they go to the camp of the Arameans. And when they reached the edge of the camp, no one was there. For the Lord had caused the Arameans to hear the sound of chariots and horses and a great army, so that they shouted to one another, "Look, the king of Israel has hired the Hittite and Egyptian kings to attack us." And so they got up and fled in the dark. An army sitting in their camp, having sieged Samaria in for a long time, suddenly starts to hear the rumbling of horses and chariots, the clashing of swords and shields, the clanking of armor and boots. They start to hear it even though it didn't actually exist. Something God had just caused them to hear. And they hear it and they think, it clearly can't just be Israel. Their army isn't big enough to do anything against us. They must have made an alliance. They must have hired the kings of the Hittites and the Egyptians to rid us from their presence. And in fear for their lives, they get up and run as fast as they can. They leave their camp set up. They leave their belongings in it. And they flee in fear of their lives. The lepers have made their way there. Verse 8. The men who had leprosy reached the edge of the camp, entered one of the tents, and ate and drank. And then they took silver, gold, and clothes and went off and hid them. And they returned and entered another tent and took some things from it and hid them also. They get to the camp and they walk into the first tent. Food that they've been longing for, and so they feast. Drink they've been longing for, and so they toast and celebrate. And then material possessions like they've never known, silver and gold. And so they take them and they run out of the tent and they hide them. They go into another tent and they find more food and more drink and more gold and more silver and more clothes. And so they take more of it from a second tent and they go and hide it again. They're doing everything naturally that we would all do, celebrating the good fortune they found and hoarding it for themselves until they start to recognize something. What if this isn't for just us? What if there's more going on in a bigger picture we're supposed to be a part of? And so they say to each other, what we're doing is not right. This is a day of good news, and we're keeping it to ourselves. If we wait until daylight, punishment will overtake us. Let's go at once and report this to the royal palace. And so they leave. They leave the food and the drink and the gold and the silver and the clothes. They leave the blessings they've just found, and they run back to the gates where they had been outcast to. Knowing they still can't enter the city because of their own leprosy, they simply shout out to the gatekeepers, "The Arameans are gone. Somebody tell the king. Let the palace know we're free again. We can come out, we can eat, we can drink, we can roam, we can farm, we can have our livestock, we can live again. We're free." And so the gatekeepers shout throughout the city, throughout the town, makes its way into the royal palace. The Arameans have left us. The camp is empty. Let's all go out and celebrate. And as the king hears the news, he responds skeptically. "I think I know what's happening," the king says. "I'll tell you what the Arameans have done to us. They know we're starving. So they've left their camp to hide in the countryside, thinking that surely that we would come out. And then they would take us alive and they'd get into our city. This is just a trick. It's just another trap. It's just a plan. We can't go celebrate. We can't go eat their food. We can't go drink their drinks. We can't walk out of Samaria, because if we do, surely we'll be ambushed. Surely we'll die." One of his officers said, "Okay, you're allowed to think that. That's fine. Will you at least test it? Let's send 5 people, 5 soldiers on horses, and let's send them to the camp with a chariot. And as they get there, they'll tell us and show us what the fates of all of our nation will be. If they get there and they're killed, we'll recognize the siege hasn't lifted and that we're likely to die here in Samaria. But if they get there and they live and celebrate and feast, then we can go join with them." And so the soldiers with their horses and 2 chariots run out to the camp, and nobody's there. They search the countryside and the hillside. There's no army waiting. They look at the road leading away from Samaria and towards the Jordan River, and they see strewn about on it more swords and more armor, more clothing. As the Arameans were running in fear, they continued to try to make themselves as quick as possible, just throwing whatever they could take off behind them. And so the soldiers follow, and they say, it's not just an empty camp. The path is empty as far as we can chase. We've made it to the Jordan River, and there's still nobody. And so they get back and they report it to the village. They report it to the city. They report it to the palace. The siege has been lifted. So the people of God go out and they begin to eat and they begin to drink and they begin to gain material blessings left to them by the Arameans. It says then in verse 16, then the people went out and plundered the camp of the Arameans. And so a seah of the finest flour sold for a shekel, and 2 seahs of barley sold for a shekel, just as the Lord had said. Now the king had put the officer on whose arm he leaned in charge of the gate. And the people trampled him in the gateway, and he died, just as the man of God Elisha had foretold them when the king came down to his house. One day later, they're celebrating like Elisha has said. God has shown himself faithful again in a new season. It took some heartache, it took tragedy, there was difficulty on the journey, but again, God shows himself faithful to his people in that moment. As we get ready to enter a new season as a church, there's a couple of things from the story I think stand out and apply well to us. The first is the simple phrase that the lepers spoke. This is a day of good news, and we're keeping it to ourselves. Something good has taken place in our lives or in our community, and it's for everybody. It's for all of us to celebrate together. And these lepers recognize that when good things are happening, they're supposed to be shared. That's the way it works. And so our hope as we launch a new service is not that we do so because we want numbers. We want to share good news. And we believe we do that well by being ready for new people to join us, by making space for new people. And so our hope is that as we've prepared space, believing that God has led us to do so, that we would then, as a community, share the good news of who God is. Now, that can look a couple of different ways. Maybe the easiest will be like inviting somebody to join you. Rob talked about it last week. We've got these cards again here this week on the tables as you leave. One side simply tells people what our service times are. The other side right now tells people the series that we'll be going through for the next 3 weeks. A series on healthy relationships with everyone. I'll give you advance notice on exactly what's going to be covered in that series in case you do want to invite somebody to it. We're going to spend 3 weeks talking about how to have healthy relationships, but it's because we believe the healthiest of relationships are modeled after the relationship of how God shows his love to us and how he asks us to love other people. And so, next week, we'll look at how God asks us to love others first, even before they love us, to extend love to others. Like God loved us first before we deserved it, that we would express love. We believe healthy relationships are formed on love, and our job is to love first. The second week, we'll talk about how we love at cost, how God loved us to the point where he was willing to pay a price, his own son, for us, and then he asks us to have self-sacrificial love for others as well. That if we want to have healthy relationships with everyone, we'll love them first, and we'll love them at cost to ourselves. And then third, that we would literally love everyone. That whatever that topic is, whatever that hot button issue is, whatever that group of people is that just grinds against you, that you'd recognize that God's hope for us is that we would love everyone as he loves everyone. If we would do that well, individually and corporately, we'd have healthy relationships with everybody. If we loved first, if we loved at cost to ourselves, and if we loved everyone, our relationships would be healthy. And you can invite people to come and join that. And one of the other things I recognize, though, is that sharing of good news is hard. It can feel uncomfortable. People will say no. The statistics aren't in our favor on how willing people would be to do so. I was looking at Twitter on New Year's Day, and a pastor that I follow had tweeted out, "Hey, I spoke a message yesterday on December 31st on New Year's resolutions I would hope people would make, and I think it would actually serve well for every Christian." And he put a link to it. It's a retired pastor. He was a guest speaking. He put a link to a blog he had written and shared part of his message. And I read it, and parts of it were encouraging to me, and parts of it were saddening to me. I'm going to read some of it to you. This is from a pastor named Bob Russell, who started a church in Kentucky and grew it from its 35 founding members to when he retired, it was a church of roughly 30,000 people. He wrote this: "Studies show that the vast majority of people come to Christ primarily because someone invited them to visit a church service. In spite of all the current discussion about missional churches versus attractional churches, the bottom line is that most people come to know the Lord because a friend invited them to church. They come, they hear the gospel preached, they like the experience enough to return, and eventually may give their life to Christ and be baptized." Studies also show that the longer we are a Christian, the less evangelistic we are. One survey revealed that less than 2% of invitations to attend a church are extended by people who have been Christians for at least 6 years. I want to give you that stat again. Less than 2% of invitations to attend a church are given by people who have been Christians at least 6 years. We become less evangelistic as we grow older. I see little evidence, again, Bob Russell's words, that we're doing much better at inviting non-believers to participate in our home groups or small groups. We simply stay in our comfort zone and bend over backwards not to offend anyone by bringing up anything religious. That's pathetic. That's cowardice. And that's an indication that we don't really believe Jesus' promise that whoever believes and is baptized will be saved, but whoever does not believe will be condemned. And so, I, Bob Russell again, would like to challenge you on the eve of 2018 to make a simple but significant New Year's resolution. It's a resolution that could make an eternal difference in the lives of scores of people who are now without God and without hope in the world. Resolve that once a month, you'll invite at least one person to attend church with you. I'm tempted to say once a week, but I'm making this as easy as possible. The absolute minimum effort for 2018 ought to be that we invite at least one person a month to go to church with us. After the first service, somebody asked me, if I invite 12 people to come next week, can I be off the hook for the rest of the year? We have good news. Good news isn't simply the church we attend. I hope you love the church we attend, but we have good news that God loves His people, that He transforms His people, that He's made a way to reconcile His people, that He offers the free gift of life to all people. We have that good news, and it would be a shame if we kept it to ourselves. In an ideal world, I wouldn't even care if you were inviting people to church. That is not the goal. The goal is to see people reconciled to Christ. And so I'd rather you be having conversations about exactly what Christ can be in their life and mean in their life. But maybe what's easiest for some of you is to invite them to a place where you know that might happen, where they can learn about those things. And so we hope to equip you to do that. As you leave today, take as many cards as you would use to invite people to the next 3 weeks. At the same time, I know there's other people not responding like the lepers. You hear of the new season of the church and you respond instead like the king. Skeptical. Will this actually work? Is it actually the right decision? Are we actually doing what we should be doing? Or are we just causing change for change's sake? And I'd encourage you to respond like he was encouraged to respond. Test it out. Try it. Expect and see that maybe God's at work in ways you haven't been imagining. Just simply test it out. And we may see, when we don't know what will happen, lots of people come and give their life to Jesus. I want to admit a couple of things. Here's what will happen starting next week. Whichever service you would choose to attend next week, it will feel different. And my best guess is whichever service you'll choose to attend next week will have less people in it than you're used to worshiping alongside here at Nowthen Alliance Church. The thing I know culturally to be true, different feels bad. That's just like a fact of life. Change is hard and different feels bad. And so the likely emotion you would experience next week is something that feels different, and you're going to want to think, and that means it's bad. I have no idea what to expect next week. I have no idea who's going to show up at which services, who's going to decide they don't want to show up to any of the service. I have no idea if it's going to be 20 below and none of us are going to want to go to any service. I have no idea what's going to happen next week. The truth of the matter is, though, I also 2 weeks ago on Christmas Eve had no idea what would happen. No idea how many people would decide to attend their normal Sunday morning service times and how many people would choose to attend a more traditional 3 o'clock in the afternoon Christmas Eve celebration time. I had no idea what to expect when I went to bed Saturday night. But you know what happened? We showed up, we talked about who God was, and 5 people gave their life to Jesus that day. We had no idea what would happen, but 5 people came to know Jesus. I've got no idea what's going to happen next week. I've got no idea what's going to happen on the 21st or the 28th as we go through this series. I have no idea what to expect. But I know I'll be here and I'll test it out. I know I'll be here and I'll follow faithfully in what I believe God has led us towards. I know I'll be here, and while it might not be next week or on the 21st or on the 28th, it might be 6 months from now, I believe we'll be celebrating 5 or 6 or 10 or 15 or however many more people who will come to know Jesus and be reconciled to God because we decide the good news just isn't for us. It's for a community that surrounds us, and we want to be prepared for them and reaching out to them. And so I would encourage you, just test it out. 3 weeks. Come all 3 weeks, invite people with you all 3 weeks and test it out. And when it feels different, and because it feels different, that means it feels bad, say, but maybe I'll pray that God would open my eyes like he did to Elisha and his servant, and I'll see that we're surrounded by something that, while it doesn't feel the same in the room, is beyond what I've ever known or expected. That's my hope and my prayer. Again, not because the goal is to fill rooms. The goal is to see people's lives transformed by the goodness of who Christ is. We want to celebrate that. I don't want to end by focusing on that. I'm going to invite the worship team to come back and join me. And we're going to celebrate by taking communion together.